Hey folks, welcome to the fireside chat with Karthik and Roman. Round of introductions. Roman, you want to go first?
Yeah, absolutely. And first of all, thanks for having me. Really good company to be discussing this topic in. So just a few tidbits, factoids about myself. So I've been in Silicon Valley for a pretty long time, started a few companies, but also have been on the what you would call a governance, side of the open source projects, for a long time within the Apache Software Foundation and Linux Foundation. Sort of my companies also tend to be all based on the open source, and the last company, Zidata, basically had this really interesting split between how you monetize open source. So we basically had an operating system that was completely free and open source given to the Linux Foundation. And then sort of the services on top of that operating system, was how we monetized it. So there was a control plane for the edge computing that was basically the monetization point. And I'm actually looking to start a new company in the AI space, also, fully open source. So think of it as GitLab for AI developers.
Nice. Exciting. Thanks, Roman. Karthik?
Yeah, great intro, Roman. Thanks. Didn't know about the GitLab thing. But anyway, hey folks, quick intro on myself. I'm Karthik Ranganathan, one of the co-founders and the CTO of the company Yugabyte, and also involved with the Yugabyte DB project, which is completely open source. We're building a cloud-native database. It turns out it's not my first database that I'm both open source wise or database wise. It so happens that everything I've been involved in the open source side has been a database. So we built an open sourced Apache Cassandra with some other folks from Facebook. I'm also one of the committers into HBase, Apache HBase, which is another Apache project. So great to have you, especially on the panel, Roman, and to be discussing this with you. So because a lot of Apache background, fond memories for me. So
exactly.
Thanks, Karthik. And I am Prasad Radhakrishnan, part of the open source and community engineering team at Yugabyte. Discuss is there a trust erosion? And because there are a few folks who do say that, hey, there is trust erosion in the world of open source software because of some of the recent licensing shifts that have happened. I'm going to use next set of slides to bring few instances where license shifts happen, and then talk about what impact it has had, if any, either on the community or on the user base and so on. The first one being very recent is HashiCorp, roughly a month ago. They started with the MPL, which is a copyleft licensing model. And from there now they have moved on to a business source license. And I think Terraform, I would say, is the most impacted project among all the other open source projects that HashiCorp has. And recently, I think we have also seen Terraform being forked, OpenTF. So there's a project that has now kickstarted, so community can continue to use Terraform and enhance it and develop and so on. Let's see how what's going to happen to that. And then Couchbase, they started out with Apache 2.0, and they have flipped over to a business source license. It happened a while ago. And MongoDB, I don't think they were Apache licensed. Some kind of a copyleft. I think AGPL. From there, they have moved to server-side public license. And I'm not sure if there was another shift or change that has happened and on top of this in more recent times, but certainly they're not on AGPL anymore, on the core MongoDB itself. And Akka started out as Apache 2.0 project, and they have also recently pivoted away from a permissive license model to something a lot more restrictive. And what we also know is that a fork of Akka before the licensing shift is now an Apache project that perhaps Roman can touch on in a little bit. And Redis Labs, core Redis is still an open source project. The modules and the extensions on top have moved away from AGPL to some other restrictive license model. And similarly, Confluent started out the Confluent management plane, although it was not part of the core Apache Kafka project, was under Apache 2.0 license, which now, along with KSQL, is under what's called a Confluent community license, a little restrictive, maybe like copyleft. or maybe even more restrictive than a copyleft. I'm not sure about that, but certainly a shift that has happened. Now, one thing to say is, there are a lot of drivers. Sometimes, there are a lot of good reasons why these vendors, shifted away from a permissive or copyleft license over to something more restrictive. So there's no right or wrong. I think there are only perspectives and different points of view on this matter itself. But I would like to, get Roman and Karthik's thoughts on these shifts and what, this means for the industry itself, and does it have an impact on, the trust the community and users, have on open source projects.
I think, I basically have two kind of observations on all of this, right? Because to me, and like I said, I've been in the open source community, especially on the governance side, for quite some time. So, you always see these types of isolated incidents, right? A vendor sort of pulling the rug under the community here and there. But a lot of times it's like, well, it's not my community. Maybe it's, useful to talk about it, but, I'm not affected personally. The project is not like, that sort of significant. And we kind of kept having those isolated incidents, but I think the proverbial straw that broke the camel's neck was the HashiCorp license change, and that is for two reasons, right? First, HashiCorp was basically really well entrenched in a lot of different enterprises. So it kind of generated a lot of trust that it's a MPL licensed project, but it's still an open source project. So it's okay to use it. But once they changed the license, and they actually picked the most sort of notoriously business unfriendly license in that space. Once they changed the license, it basically was immediate throughout the enterprises. Even the legal counsels got involved, right? Because all the previous instances, like, well, yeah, geeks will talk about it, that's about it. But this is the first time when, you basically had chiefs of legal at all these various corporations basically saying, like, we need to yank, this product out because the license is such that we can get sued. Like, it's real. This is scary. And to some extent, it's really unfortunate that it happened. But on the other hand, I think it's a very useful forcing function for all of us to actually have a conversation like we're having right now and talk about, different ramifications of, these isolated incidents. Because it's real, like, and I think you framed the discussion exactly right. It is the erosion of trust that we all need to discuss. Because if that trust by the enterprises in open source gets eroded, then none of the participants in this economy will be happy, right? Enterprises stopping using open source or sort of putting significant barriers would be super bad. Like us, open source developers, not having that market to sell into would be super bad. Like everybody loses in this, right? So to me, you framed it exactly right. How do we help restore some of the trust, or at least reverse the trend, now that we have the singular, almost seismic event in the industry of HashiCorp?
Great. So, so I'll add maybe a couple of thoughts to what you said, Roman, like a slightly perhaps different perspective. When you look at it, and I'm coming at it obviously from both a technical perspective, which is my background, and also from the perspective of building, like commercializing, right? Like from how do you build a business around it also. So if you look at all of these instances above, right? Like, and you look at what are the instances where open source has really succeeded and there's no thought of going back, I think it forms an interesting contrast, right? You find pretty much that most of the communities that are single vendor driven and are fighting for adoption. So they're a new paradigm, they're a new adoption thing, and they are single vendor driven, and they have to go fight for that mind share. You find that the dominant vendor is often pushing, like, whatever it is their software does, they're evangelizing, they're creating the community, growing it, and also contributing software. And you find, and they feel that after a while, there's a lot of people freeloading, so to speak, on them, and they're not getting back the value of the open source contributions. And so they have to form these things, which is definitely a breach of trust on the community side, no questions asked. And it's also, in some sense, myopic in the long run, because you do want to play for long-term growth, not short-term growth. However, all that said, I think it is a real perception on the part of the company, on the commercial entity, that they're the ones putting in all the work, they're the ones putting in all the software, and everybody else is reaping benefits, right? So every one of these examples before are of that kind. Now, if you take some other examples, Like if you take, say, Linux, if you take Postgres, if you take Kubernetes, there's a number of such examples, MySQL, there's a number of such examples. And there are a number of vendors that have made money on these things, but there are a number of those vendors and a lot of other people also contributing to both features as well as growing that community and the user community and the usage and stickiness and adoption and all of that. You find that there's a lot less worry in those communities to actually make it restrictive. So it actually is a part of a positive feedback loop where those communities grow bigger and bigger, and where you start making it restrictive, it starts imploding at some point, right? Yeah, you'll have your runway for the short term, like these companies trying to move out, but the point is they're trying to move out and you have to think about it and what is the 5-year implication of that? And you can't really go back because once you've breached the trust, it's kind of a one-way street right after that. So just a couple of thoughts from, more of a technology / adoption / company perspective.
That's exactly right. And I think I really agree with that view. And especially, in a sense that when people talk about open source, it feels like all of the open source is created equal. And I actually blame the, us, open source developers a little bit, because we kind of like just attach this label open source, to everything. Now there's also free software. We used to use that term, like Libre software, there's a lot of different terms, but like if you look at the usage, I mean, open source is basically 90% of the time, people just talk about open source. And I feel that we're actually playing a bit of a joke on ourselves, because, if you look at the strict definition of the open source, what it is, right? That definition is basically governed by this organization called OSI, Open Source Initiative. And it has nothing to do with the governance. It has nothing to do with, stability of the community. It has nothing to do with economics or, anything like that, right? It simply has to do with the type of a license that will be attached to your source code, right? So I think, license is obviously the first step. And, it's like table stakes. You have to have a license, it has to be welcoming and permissive, for you to be called open source. But then all these other questions, to your point, kick in, right? What is the mixture between, users and developers, right? How many are freeloaders versus, people who are contributing, right? What is the governance, structure of the project? Like if the company A gets pulled out, from the project or just pulls out by itself, will the project survive? Like all these questions get asked, and we don't even have a right term to describe like the next step up of, stability of an open source project, right? Now, at the Apache Software Foundation or Linux Foundation, to your point, we kind of try to basically make more of a focus on the governance. But the problem is we don't even have a name for it. Like, if I want to describe, I have to use some kind of a name of like, there's an open source as defined by OSI, and then there is all this stuff that Apache Software Foundation or Linux Foundation does on top of it. Like, what do we call it? And I actually feel that's a big problem in the industry, because everybody sort of understands that there is value, but we don't even have a good name for that value.
And there's another subtlety also that I think there's no good name for. Like for example, we talk about, say, all of these examples that you just showed, Prasad, like you showed Mongo, you showed Redis, you showed a whole bunch of these, right? And these are open source, right? But if you look at Linux is open source, but what is Linux really? Are we talking about CentOS? Are we talking about Ubuntu? Or are we talking about Alma? There's a whole bunch of Linux, but they're all the Linux open source project, right? But there's a whole bunch of them. Similarly, if you look at, and with Yugabyte DB, I think I could say, I'm bringing this point up because it's a little bit selfish, is that in the Postgres umbrella, there's a ton of different variants of Postgres, but they're all just Postgres at the end, right? Like the end user can use them just like they do Postgres. Now, like you were talking about, I think, Roman, how I think with HashiCorp's change in license, and there's a fork, and now the fork and the original, which is not open source anymore, they will kind of behave similarly, right? It's Terraform, I think, right? Like equivalent of Terraform, whatever it is. So these two will be, and they'll form a family of such products, right? Which is the same umbrella. So there's the umbrella, a community, which qualifies as that community. So the Linux community, you don't want to really talk about the CentOS community, Ubuntu, it's the Linux community. Similarly, the Postgres community, right? And there can be a lot of things inside. So that variant is also not captured. When it is a community of one, with one dominant, that's when it's even like Kubernetes, right? There's a lot of people doing enhancements to it. There's a lot of community, there's one community, Kubernetes community, a lot of people doing it, right? So these variants are also not captured, not just in vendors, but also products.
Agreed.
A quick refresher on how this all started. So it's Richard Stallman, I guess mid 80s, 85 or 86, around the time frame. Came up with first, somebody who even defined, hey, what is free software, right? So he came up with this four freedoms of free software. Like an array, it is numbered from 0 to 3. Freedom 0, freedom to use the program for any purpose, and then freedom to study or make changes as you wish, and then to redistribute, make copies of it, and then improve it, and to be able to even have the modified versions, sell it, and so on. Pretty much no restrictions, right? So that was the classic definition of free software how it was defined in the mid 80s. And then, interestingly, Stallman, I believe right away around the time frame itself, came up with what is today, commonly referenced as copyleft, which is actually a made-up word, stands for the opposite of copyright, which meant that if you made any changes to, or used a particular piece of open source software that is copyleft, you would have to make the new thing that you created, have the same license be applicable to it. Then, to understand, what is really, how is the playfield set? What does now the open source community or projects, how does it look like? So I think there are two key things to understand, from my perspective. One is, what is the type of license that the open source project is using? And I want to say there are three broad categories. One is permissive, like Apache 2.0 or MIT, where you can do whatever you want with it, pretty much. You can modify it, you can resell it, you can make a SaaS product out of it, whatever that might be. I mean, Yugabyte is Apache 2.0 license. And then copyleft, like I said, I already covered what copyleft is, GPL, AGPL, MPL, or few examples of copyleft licenses. There are quite a few new licensing models that have come out. Let's just call it confusing, a bucket called confusing. I'm not going to
That's a really good name.
It's a great name.
And with regards to the project itself, obviously somebody came up with an idea that became an open source project. So there are key set of creators and maintainers for that, plus some governance model around it. And then you have other folks who fall in love with the project and they become contributors. They're trying to enhance it. They are trying to develop a new feature or even make major contributions. There are contributors, and there are users who have use for this open source technology, end up using it. And some folks extend it and they end up creating derivative products for whatever the reasons that might be. So that's kind of how that's level set, or that's how the playing field looks like, I want to say, on the open source front. Would you agree with the Roman, or any entity or faculty that I'm missing?
No, I think roughly that's what's happening, and to some extent, these are the constituent sort of groups, right? That again, when we talk about trust, these are the members of that trust circle, right? You need to set it up in such a way that there is mutual trust in every direction. But I think in terms of how you capture the groups of these types of participants, that's exactly right.
Great. Now that said, now I'm going to put some questions in front of you both, so so the viewers can benefit from your opinions or thoughts. I'm just going to toss it all out one shot, and then let's pick up the conversation from there. So now, so we just touched on some perhaps some of the reasons, and I think we still did not touch on the key reasons why these shifts happen. Obviously, there is a lot of these companies are either publicly listed or funded by VCs or both. So therefore, there is pressure, and they do not want some. And we all know who made most money out of Hadoop, right? So the cloud providers end up making more money sometimes, and sometimes, like for instance, I know that for a lot of these even popular projects, the SaaS product came from somebody else, not the creators first, and then the original creators of this open source project came up with the SaaS offering much later, where you already lost some market. So there is obviously pressure to go and grab the market, or there's revenue pressure and so on. So that said, why even do OSS? Because Karthik, this is your second sort of rodeo, right? During your Facebook time, it was Apache Cassandra that came out, and then you have now you're having a startup that is Yugabyte Apache 2.0 licensed, right? And it's very risky given what has happened. It's very risky for, I think, the company, very risky for the contributors or the end users as well. Let's just call it. So why even do OSS? So what is now the motivation or driver to do this? Or do you even still feel, motivated, Karthik, that you still want to keep this open
No,
source?
I think, yeah. Good question. I think very motivated to stay open source, so no questions about that. But let me give you, so we had to do a lot of research on this, right? Like essentially we had to decide our go-to-market model in some sense, and that required deciding whether we're going to be open source or not, and what license if we are, and what do we deal with, what are we looking at, etc. So maybe let me give our thoughts from a Yugabyte point of view, and it's like if you include HBase, it's the third rodeo. So I'm probably still deciding after having if playing it your way, I should be really crazy to have done this a third time. But anyway, but it's not. That's not quite how I see it. We were technologists. We'd been in the open source community. We're first-time entrepreneurs. We never built a company. So we said, yeah, okay. Our gut reaction, our gut call was to just go open source. And they said, no, don't do it. And 2016 was very uncertain for open source, for those of you who can remember what happened back then, right? And so we still wanted to go open source, but we said it's going to take a long time to build a database anyway, so let's get cracking, and we figured this thing out. So we figured it out for a whole year. And what we realized was it was just the cusp where it was turning for open source companies, and they were starting to go in the right direction, and it's something we wanted to do. Now, we also heard loud and clear from our own like people that we spoke to. I can't call them customers or users at that time. We were still building the thing, but all the people we spoke to, they said, it's very specific to Yugabyte. We are helping people move a relational database to the cloud, a cloud native relational database, public or private, right? And so who are the people that are who are the incumbents in this space? Well, it's Oracle, SQL Server, DB2, yada, yada, blah, blah. All of these are proprietary companies, and they said they won't move to a proprietary relational database that's new. It's simply too risky, and extortionist behavior kicks in, and they don't have the freedom and all of that other stuff. So it simply put, a part of this was just a need of the hour, right? But our investors still kept saying, no, don't go open source. It's not going to work out for you. So we said, we're going to make it open core. Okay. Note that this is at the same time that folks like Snowflake actually were cloud only, right? But the nature of the OLTP transactional database market is different from the analytic database market, because if a transactional database is down, these customers, their business critical applications are down, and they're losing fistful of dollars, a lot of money. The impact is huge. Whereas with an analytic database, yes, there's inconvenience, it's still important, but you can still move your business forward, and you can just have a relatively comparatively smaller impact on your top line revenue. So it was important for us. Now, we did soul searching on all the different license types, everything you flashed out, permissive, copyleft, all of that stuff. And here was the takeaway. We felt that modern days GPL is no longer relevant as much as it used to be. And if you think about it, it makes sense, because back in the 90s, if you can picture back in the 90s, because I can barely do that now, but if you do, you will remember that people would say, oh, these open source people that are developing software, they're just one weird bunch, and we're not going to ever use this open source stuff, and nobody uses free software, and come on, is this even real, and so on. This is the early 90s, that's how it was. The behavior of the industry was such that you had to encourage people to contribute, and there's no other way to do it other than saying, if you make a single line of code, you better contribute it back. And so open source is a thing. But Linux gets mainstream, it starts getting really popular, it becomes a viable alternative. MySQL started at the same time, adopted a similar license, that starts getting, so as they start now, people in the industry are like, oh, wait a minute, this actually makes sense, this is really good. You no longer need to retrain people's behavior, so it moved on to a permissive license. Now, Postgres doesn't use Apache 2.0, but it uses an equally permissive license, right? Back then, it didn't matter. There was no license. There was no open source back then, right, when Postgres started. So anyways, now you move forward into this era of people becoming very permissive, and then came the public clouds. Now, what did the public clouds do? Let's take Amazon. Amazon was simply trying to make their cloud very successful. And they said, what do people want? What are they struggling with? Oh, they're struggling to run all these open source things. Okay, let me run it for you. Now, they ran something for their end users that the end users saw value. End users said, wait a minute, this is even easier than me running it myself or through that other vendor that's providing this. Let me move to this vendor that's giving me even more convenience, ease of use, and guarantees, because they have economies of scale. But if you really look at it, the fault really lies in the vendor not embracing the cloud, not the cloud picking it up to make themselves relevant. If the vendor had said, okay, I will bet on your cloud, and I'm going to go and build a service on your cloud, well, there would have been a revenue share, and would have been a whole different history rewritten in a completely different way. Now, when the vendors realized that the cloud providers are actually making more money, they obviously immediately pivoted to creating their own cloud. They did, but it was a race, right? Like, so they already took the lead, the cloud providers took the lead. And what is the way to, and the cloud providers aren't small, they're pretty good. They have big teams, strong teams. So what is the way they are, so the vendors were not able to create value on the software side quicker than the cloud providers. So what do? They start playing restriction games in order to grow. Right? So that's really the gist of it. And if you correlate it with the conversation we had before, these vendors are the only ones growing the community. The community isn't big enough to support too many of these. So it now becomes, oh my God, there's so much of revenue that I lost because somebody else is free riding on what I did. Whereas the other side feels like they are giving the end user the convenience and the value they always deserved and they could get with their own product. So now that comes to us. So we started open core because our investors told so, and we saw all of these companies going to restrictive or the funny licenses, the ones that the confusing licenses. And so we actually in early 2019 went the other way. We said, you know what, our company is founded on a basis of DBaaS being the core thing and the database being open source. That was always our start. Like in month 2 of the company, we started building our DBaaS. Our DBaaS is built in a way that we can ship it into the customer's cloud account or private cloud, or we can run it for them. It's the same software. So not only is the DB the same, the DBaaS is the same as well, right? So this gives us the ability to be very clear to the customer, look, the database is open source. You need the trust and freedom. The DBaaS is what we charge for, and we can work across all the clouds, including your private cloud, the same way. And this makes it such a simple story that when we went fully open source, it actually spurred adoption and increased revenue, not went the other way and saw us lose people. We never lost people. Right? So net, I think the move has been very positive for us. We consider ourselves as playing in the Postgres ecosystem. The Postgres ecosystem is so massive and growing so fast that even one of the mega cloud providers cannot capture all the monetary value or the upside there. They cannot capture it. So there's so much there that all of the vendors can be supported. And we're very happy with the rate at which we're innovating. So we feel we're in a good place, even if somebody picks it up. So that's the story for us, the drivers, motivations, etc.
So Roman, now your new startup, again, it's going to be in the open source and monetization on top, right? So you're not giving up either. So even your new startup is going to be on the same model. So now again, given the recent shifts that have happened, with all the other popular open source projects, what gives you the confidence?
Yeah, no, I'm actually very much in agreement with what Karthik just said, because, to me, the open source, the way I look at it, right, open source is basically how you grow the pie. So, and, when you pitch to VCs, they always ask you about total addressable market, and open source is the best way to basically make that total addressable market as big as possible, right? There's just no other tool that is as successful as that. Now, once you've grown the pie, and hopefully, maybe there will be some people along the way helping you to grow the pie. Now that you've grown the pie, you basically have to capture a certain, percentage of that pie, right? That's where the business strategy and sort of go-to-market strategy kicks in. And there you can have like really different, types of plays. Some people still do open source monetization through, very kind of old school means, by effectively doing just old school services, where you kind of show up and you build something for the customer, using the bits and pieces of the open source. But what the customer is really buying is the outcome, not the technology, right? And if you're just building the outcome, then doing it through open source is the easiest way because, again, it's very trusted, coming back to this notion of trust. People sort of see that it has longevity because, again, let's take Postgres community. If any single vendor in the Postgres community gets hit by a bus, obviously there's so much expertise and so much, talent in that pool that, that sort of project can be picked up and, supported. But then, you have all these other ways of, monetizing. And my favorite one is basically helping solve pain points, right? Because, to me, it's much, there's this sort of saying goes that it's actually much more effective to sell painkillers than, vitamins. So I like saying, selling painkillers. And a lot of times when you start talking to your customer, but that's the tricky, interesting thing. The way you engage with the customer is typically through the open source because, they come, they try, they give you feedback. And a lot of times they would even give you feedback not through some kind of a formal mean of, customer advisory board, but they would just show up on Slack and they say like, hey, I have this proprietary whatever, and I want to use your technology and I need like an adapter and, all of a sudden you start discovering these bits and pieces of what's really painful for the enterprise when it comes to adopting your technology. Because again, like we're all technologists, we like selling products that are well defined. Like here's a database, here's a SQL, front end to it. Like, here's a bunch of connectors, like go, right? But it's much more sophisticated than that in a typical deployment. And figuring out what really is a pain point in a deployment is where you get a lot of value, and that's a good kind of value, right? Because the license change is, you effectively scare the customer into paying you. It's a bit like, Racket, right? You kind of change the license terms, you show up in a customer, at the customer, and you basically say like, nice business you've got going here. Like shame if anything were to happen to it, if I so much as sue you, right? It's like, that doesn't really build long-term viable relationship with the customer. But if you find the pain points, that's much easier. So to me, you basically grow the market and you grow the total addressable market through essentially the open source and maximum exposure. But then you kind of show up on the enterprise side and you try to solve the real pain points and you figure out all these, really interesting ways of monetizing. A lot of times, you could be scared and you say like, well, but what if somebody big, shows up in my community and starts solving that same pain points and maybe even open sourcing, those solutions? That's actually great, because that means that your core technology is being used everywhere, and you might actually lose a few monetization points, but surely there is more. Like in mine, I've been doing this, like Karthik, I've been playing this game for a long time. There is not a single enterprise where once you end up there, you cannot keep solving their problems, for 10, 15 years, right? They're all like that. And I think, that to me is the good way of making business out of open source, as opposed to, sort of scaring the customer into paying you.
Awesome. So one thing I guess, neither of you touched was like, who feels the most betrayed when these shifts do happen?
It's the end user, I would say, the customer, the end user.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I think, the end user is basically in the most vulnerable position, right? Because the sort of the impact is immediate. But I think it's also useful to talk about, developers. And typically we talk about developers by saying like, well, I contributed to this project, thinking that it will forever remain open and the fruits of my labor will be shared by this license. And now all of a sudden you're changing the license. So like, what does it mean for me? Like, are you going to pay me now, for what I contributed to the project? Because you're obviously in business of making like real money off of it now. So there's this like kind of visceral reaction by the developers. But I think in terms of impact, it's more of a psychological impact that they're having, which is very right. And like, I get where the emotion is coming from. But in terms of business continuity, it's obviously on the customer side. Now, on the customer side, and again, like I wish we had a bit more of the kind of education going on about the value that foundations and viable communities bring to the table, because the customers, again, they always just think about open source as this homogeneous thing. What I feel they feel betrayed, on is not even like, yes, there is a lot of, you change the license, like now I cannot continue my business, I have to figure something out, there is that bit. But also they feel like a lot of times I talk to them and they feel betrayed that we as a community haven't even explained to them the rules of the game. They're like, we thought you'd just keep doing that. Like, that's how we understood, the engagement model, right? And all of a sudden the license changing and the community moves on. Now, the good news is that if the project has managed truly to be as ubiquitous as to be like really, as big of a change as what Hashi went through, there's typically enough community to basically take it elsewhere. And that's actually the beauty of open source, right? Obviously my favorite example would be, Akka that turned into the Apache Peko, because again, a lot of people were building on top of it. And then when they sort of swap the license term, they're like, no, we can take the last version of what we have built that's still licensed under the Apache license, take it to the Apache Foundation and, create a viable community out of it, not a single vendor-driven project. But a lot of times, and maybe that's actually like my question to Karthik, how do you see that sort of playing out in the Postgres community? A lot of times when this seismic event happens, the discovery is that there is no there, right? There's like the vendor was the community. And the good news, again, for Akka and for Hashi is that the community is definitely there. But Karthik, what do you think about, the Postgres? Like, is it the same just without any kind of formal foundation? Like, there is definitely a community that if any single vendor does something funny, the community will still sort of march on.
Yeah, I think, I feel the Postgres community is actually quite strong from that point of view, without a formal governance, without a formal any of that stuff. But there's different trade-offs, right? Like in the Postgres community, again, what I'm saying is the good part of what Postgres does, right? Completely decentralized, like decentralized down to the tooling that is used. So like they don't use GitHub because GitHub is a vendor. And what happens if GitHub goes away? And it may seem frivolous, but it actually makes sense in the Postgres point of view because, did you guys know Postgres was majority written in Lisp when it started out, and a large part of it was rewritten in C? And so, like, for a project that has lived for so long, and for a project that has seen so many ups and downs, and now the most recent up, I think it makes sense to take I would say personally it's a little extreme, but you can see why it does make sense, right? Like from a very longevity point of view. So they're pretty secure from that point of view. But I would say that the flip side of that coin, there's always a flip side of that coin, is that you're giving up your rate of innovation, right? So now why does Yugabyte DB exist the way it does? Well, the first thing we tried to do was, can we go and transform Postgres into what we want to do? And then we are in business without anything new, but with just Postgres. But what are we trying to do? We're trying to say that most of the application building is going cloud native, and a traditional database that runs on a single node doesn't suffice. And so let's go and make it distributed or cloud native as a database. But this could be directly in like at odds with the Postgres view, which is let's make a great single node relational database, if that's how it's defined, right? So now you're in this thing about what is real innovation and how fast should you innovate and should you move forward. And so like there are some of the things that we are announcing today, which is how like for example connection management in Postgres. We're able to get a lot more, like 10 to 20 times more connections than Postgres, using different components of things in the Postgres community itself, but kind of putting them together in a very innovative way. So there's still innovation there, but that's not happened inside Postgres, and that's because sometimes the lack of a forcing function to herd everything in a single direction means that you make your way very slowly over many years, or perhaps not, and miss some of the growth opportunities that you would have had as a community. And I would say the way Postgres solves this is really by we will turn this like this. Okay, I would say the way Postgres community kind of solves for this is being very open and embracing new folks like us that are trying to create forks or spin-offs of the same project and still keeping them under the same umbrella. So it works pretty well, I would say, from one point of view. Of course, there's always trade-offs.
So thank you to both of you for sharing your thoughts. I think it's a very broad and deep topic. We could spend hours talking about it, and hopefully I'm going to do a part 2 or a sequel to this. And Roman, I would love to get a couple of more open source leaders like yourself and Karthik on, and have another talk sometime in the next few months.
That would be awesome. That would be awesome. And I feel like, again, educating the users about, what it is that we actually feel, makes the kind of models that, we talked about today special, as opposed to just calling it open source, is absolutely what we need to do. So the more, podcasts or, conference presentations like this, the better, because I feel like they would definitely underserving the user base with just basic information.
Awesome. Yeah. And thank you, Prasad, for having me. Thank you, Roman. Really enjoyed the conversation. So yeah,
yes.
Thank you guys. Really
thank you guys. And it's been a pleasure.